Welcome to episode 2 of the video series I initiated a few days ago. It provides a tutorial on the Endangered Species Act of 1973. And that's by its principal author on the Wikipedia page. That's me. I'm Connie Barlow, and today is April 2nd, 2026. And in the first episode, I already showed what I'm about here, what I'm doing, that I'm a former science writer here, 4 books, and that about 71% of the existing Wikipedia page on the Endangered Species Act of 1973 was written by me, starting in the summer of 2023, anticipating improving the page for the 50th anniversary in December of 2023. Well, it's quite a bit later, and I've still been making edits as things change to that Wikipedia page. Now, one thing's different from the previous episode. I'm wearing the same clothes, except this. This is a cowl I just received from Hazel Delcourt. And this is also changed here because this top book here is by Hazel Delcourt. It was published in 2002, and it's called Forest in Peril: Tracking Deciduous Trees from Ice Age Refuges into the Greenhouse World. And this was produced in 2002. This is just 1 year after my last of 4 books was published, 2001. Hazel's just a year or 2 older than I am. And I'm putting this book here today because I want to tell a little story. The reason that the group I got started with, Torreya Guardians, began actually moving the endangered Torreya taxifolia tree down from its peak glacial refuge in northern Florida, where its seed had floated down the Chattahoochee River down into the Apalachicola River when the ice started moving over my state here of Michigan. But after the ice retreated, it couldn't move back. It couldn't refloat up the river. And it was Hazel's book that gave me the deep time perspective on how a number of our plants were able to survive here in North America during the ice ages, because we had the kind of topography that facilitated floating down a river or moving through a north-south facing mountain area and getting down somewhere that was warm enough. Whereas Europe had some of the same tree taxa that we have, but lost them because of the geography there with the Mediterranean, the east-west trending mountains, versus the north-south that we have here in the Appalachians, and the rivers that basically head north. So we are very fortunate to be here, and I just want to keep that story here because you'll see why this is so important to me and how I ended up, in order to really help this glacial relic that was left behind in its peak glacial reserve, help it move north when the professionals and the agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service staff, were just not willing to start doing that. But it was Hazel's book that I read right after it came out that ignited in me a passion to do more than just think about it and write about it, but to found a group called Torreya Guardians. And we have been conducting those experimental plantings for the last 20-some years into northward states. So let me read a key passage here from Hazel's book that's really inspirational for me. On page 197, she says, "My personal and professional odyssey as a historian of deciduous trees has brought me to the realization that the future of the eastern deciduous forest here in America is now at risk. What have quaternary paleoecologists, quaternary means it's not the current day, but quaternary means it's from the Pleistocene on through the end of the ice ages into what we call the Holocene now. What have quaternary paleoecologists learned about forest history that can aid in understanding how great that risk is. How can we use our knowledge of the past to help preserve the biological diversity of the future? And then a few pages later, this quote: "We can provide corridors to allow for species to migrate successfully in the face of climate change. We may also need to be prepared to transplant endangered species to new locations where climate will be favorable." And transplanting, that's got the word plant in it, okay? Animals can move a lot faster than plants can, unless a plant is dispersed by wind, like willows. A lot of maple seeds can go that way too, twirling in the wind. Cottonwood trees, of course. But what's notable is that even a snail can move from generation to generation faster than plants, like the one I work with, Terrea taxifolia, Florida terrea, can move a lot faster than Florida terrea can, which is dispersed now only by squirrels, okay? Only by squirrels. And it takes about, if you're in a full sun, you can maybe get your seeds growing in 15 years, but it's a subcanopy tree, so it usually takes about 30 years, even longer than 30 years, for one generation of Florida terrea trees to begin to seed, and then those seeds be able to spend another 30 years before they can seed again. And in that meantime, we terrea guardians have looked at a century-old planting of Florida terrea in North Carolina. And what we discerned was that the farthest it could move in a century to get the squirrels to moving it was 40 yards, okay? So that's my personal story, and I'm padding like this here. Hazel retired, oh gosh, when was it, about 2005 or so, as a paleoecologist professor at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And just a couple weeks before she retired was the only time I ever met her. And then it's passed, nearly 2 decades it's passed since we've communicated. And it was such a rich communication. And that in her retirement, she's become a really expert at knitting things like this. This is a cowl. It wasn't just knit by her. She spun the very yarn that's in here now. 75% is something called Polworth form of sheep, 13% is camel, and 12% is mulberry silk. And the knitted lace pattern is called overlapping leaves. Now there's a second story relevant to my talking about this video today, and that's that I do Google alerts, and that means that whenever a key phrase comes in, Google will send me what's ever going on, generally in the news about that. So one of my Google alerts is Endangered Species Act, and today there must have been about 14 that Google sent me, usually news articles, on a new Ninth Circuit Court of California opinion on the Endangered Species Act. Not so much the act, but on regulations that for implementing the act are subject to legal review. And the second Trump administration here now had put in 6 changes, just small word changes really, into the existing regulations for implementing the Endangered Species Act. And some of them were just so small as, what does the term likely mean? That's in the act. Does it mean probable? Does it mean reasonably expected? I mean, these are things that the court has to settle out because the parties involved, yes and no, believe that they have tremendous implications for how the act will be implemented based on the inclinations of the current administration. So there's a lot of legal things going on. And what occurred to me after actually going in and reading the circuit court decision, I realized that even though I've read a lot of law review articles for working on the Endangered Species Act of 1973 Wikipedia page, a lot of law review articles, and of course a lot of academic science journal articles and environmental ethics and so forth, I had never read an actual court decision before. And what that does for me here is it really makes me understand how impossible things are now in a time when you have tremendous polarization going on. In a way, I've gotten to learn quite a bit about indigenous cultures here in America before my 10 generations ago ancestors first came into Connecticut and then on to Michigan 6 generations ago. I've learned a lot about indigenous ways, and the thought of if we could have a wisdom council now, instead of this intense polarization and legalese and so forth, but that's not possible. So I'm continuing here today. And one thing that I mentioned in the first episode was trying to put this in context of a time when the values were similar, whether you were a Republican or a Democrat or libertarian. The values were pretty similar here in America, is that we realized that we had polluted the air to such an extent that it was dangerous. We'd polluted the waters so that me, growing up in Detroit, I wasn't allowed to play in the creeks. The water was too polluted, too acidic. So 1970 was when we had Earth Day. A lot of people remember that. In my high school, I was a senior that spring in high school, and there was no mention of it. But what I've learned through the years of understanding the values of that time, let me just go through them here. In 1963, the Clean Air Act was passed. 1963. In 1964, the Wilderness Act was passed. In 1970, the National Environmental Protection Act was passed. It's called NEPA, N-E-P-A, NEPA. And that's the one that has the environmental impact statements, EIS. It's also 1970 when Earth Day happened. 1972 was the Clean Water Act. And then the fifth in this series was 1973, the Endangered Species Act. After that, a number of things happened, but in my personal experience, I was very lucky to be able to, right out of college, Michigan State University, go up to Alaska. And during my college years, I actually worked in national parks for the summer, Yellowstone, then Glacier, and then 3 years in Mount McKinley National Park. And then I stayed living there. And so for me, in 1980, during the Carter administration, when the Alaska Natural Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA, was finally passed into law, that was also a significant thing for me, and certainly many people in the country. It's over 150 million acres were set aside in that. And I might mention that during the time when Congress was considering this, I had the opportunity, living in Juneau, Alaska, that's in the southeast part of Alaska, I really became quite a sea kayaker and managed to sea kayak all along the up the eastern side of Admiralty Island, which became Admiralty National Monument. Misty Fjords down by Ketchikan, also kayaking in there. Kayaked Glacier Bay too, but Glacier Bay was already a national park. Also went to Lake Clark after it became a national park, and that's not kayaking, that's backpacking, west of Anchorage. So these are the things that really influenced me and brought me to where I stand now, of not just seeing the Endangered Species Act and the incredible back and forth and hostility on both sides. I can see both sides. The incredible hostility on both sides of this. This is where I come from, the values I come from, back when people here in America really shared a value about trying to roll back some of the injuries we had done to the, quote, environment and to biodiversity that we had done that weren't just hurting humans. But enough of stories. I'm going to move right into the screen share here for the features of the 1973 Endangered Species Act. Features of the 1973 Act as amended. Now let's first go to the table of contents here on the Wikipedia page. Part 1, we did this topic. It was just 2 paragraphs. And then this topic, you can see how many sections there were to it. The history. And now we're doing features of the 1973 Act as amended. And there's a total of 8 of them here. So this is how the Wikipedia page looks. But because I'm only reading excerpts, I downloaded a PDF and I've highlighted it. Features of the 1973 Act as amended. The Endangered Species Act is administered by 2 federal agencies, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. The National Marine Fisheries Service handles most marine species, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has responsibility over freshwater fish and all other species. Species that occur in both habitats, for example, sea turtles and Atlantic sturgeon, are jointly managed. The federal government must determine whether species are endangered or threatened. If so, they must list the species for protection under the ESA. So those are the 2 categories for listing, endangered and then a lesser category, threatened. If determinable, critical habitat must be designated for listed species. Absent certain limited situations, it is illegal to take an endangered species. Take can mean kill, harm, or harass. There is no similar statutory prohibition on the take of threatened species, although the 2 agencies may extend such protections to particular threatened species under certain circumstances. Federal agencies will use their authorities to conserve endangered species and threatened species. Federal agencies cannot jeopardize listed species' existence or destroy critical habitat. Any import, export, interstate, and foreign commerce of listed endangered species is generally prohibited. A 2016 report by the Congressional Research Service offers this summary. ESA's principal parts are the listing and protection of species, designation of critical habitat and avoidance of its destruction, and consultation by federal agencies regarding actions that may harm listed species. A 2019 report by the Congressional Research Service provides a short summary of the legal frameworks of the Endangered Species Act. Now, this particular reference with the Congressional Research Service is short, but this one, let's take a look at. So here it is in the references of the Wikipedia page, and you can see that it's been referenced 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And if you click on those, it takes you up to the point where it's been referenced. So let's click on it. And this takes us to the congress.gov and the reports by the Congressional Research Service. And this one is called the Endangered Species Act, a primer. So let's scroll down. You can see the last time it was updated was September 8th, 2016. And Endangered Species Act hasn't really been amended as a statute, so they haven't needed to do that. They haven't needed to update it. All right, we'll go past the summary and let's take a look at the table of contents. This is really thorough. There's an overview. What is the ESA? Why is the ESA controversial? And on down, has the ESA been effective? The scientific background on species loss. Major provisions, so these are all things in the Act that must be attended to. And then here's the appendices and the author information. So let's head back now over to, so we just looked at this reference. Now we'll go to where I start reading again. The Act itself has been amended 4 times, 1978, 1982, 1988, and 2004, and the details of those amendments were covered in part 1 of this video series. In recent years, U.S. presidential elections that greatly shift environmental priorities have culminated in regulatory shifts in endangered species management, back and forth. Congressional elections also affect implementation of the Act via expansions or contractions in annual funding decisions for the agencies. All right, first subsection of the features explained. Plants become eligible for listing. A distinction of the 1973 Act is that, unlike the previous legislation, plants became eligible for listing. The first plant listings occurred in 1977. 50 years later, significantly more species of plants were listed in the highest category, endangered, than animals. 766 plants and 486 animals. And just like in part 1, if it's in blue, that pertains to a kind of species or a particular species. The agency maintains a web page that lists all the endangered and threatened plant species. Okay, we're going to go there. Again, all the endangered and threatened plant species. So we'll click here. So you can see it's been referenced twice in the Wikipedia page, and now we'll click on it. All right, so here it is on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ECOS, Environmental Conservation Online System. And this particular report is Fish and Wildlife Service listed U.S. species by taxonomic group, all plants. Now, first, as I did in part 1, I'm going to click on this, and everything in blue or purple here is a distinct tabular format of things pertaining to the Endangered Species Act. Okay, let's go back to the specific one here. And you can see there's a total of 938 plants species listed. And you can sort by the group, flowering plants, you can go by species, but here the whole thing begins alphabetically, so it's conifers and cycads. And isn't that convenient that the plant I've been working with, Torreya taxifolia, is in this group. And you'll notice it's the only one that's endangered. Florida Torreya is the only one endangered. The other 4 are threatened. This one here, Cycas micronesica, that's over in the territory of the United States. It's not the continental United States, so I'm ignoring that one. Here's a couple over in California. California has a lot of endangered plants, some of which are very similar to why Torreya taxifolia is endangered, and that's the relictual species. We're going to take a close look at Pinus albicollis. That's the white bark pine. It's threatened. And the reason I'm going to click on it is that you're going to see how massive its range is. It's also very recently been listed. Okay, white bark pine, threatened. So here's the range information. Look at that. Now you'll see nothing shows up here in Canada because we don't care about Canada here. This is just an endangered species. But as it turns out, it's probably going to be going extinct in here, and there's already experimental assisted migration that the Canadians are doing up. Actually, even as far as Alaska, they're experimenting with. So continuing down here, Let's go down to the Federal Register documents. These are the legal things that have happened. And it's showing one of 10 or 12 entries, so I better go to 25 here to show all of them, because the earliest ones start at the bottom. So we've got all 12 here. 94, this was when it was first being petitioned for listing, and on through 2010, 11, 2012, 2013. This is all where it's being posted by the Fish and Wildlife Service that, okay, we're not going to list it yet. Well, things do change, and let's go up to where, here we go. Here we go. These are the two places here where you see a species status assessment is also posted. So this one was where it was first put out for comment to list it as threatened. And this one here was, after a certain period of time and review, it was actually listed as threatened. Now, species status assessment is very new. Torreya taxifolia, the plant I work with, that was given its first recovery plan back in 1986, the species status assessments weren't around then. So we're going to scroll down and take a look at the species status assessment part. All right, here we go. So you can see them both here. So this would have been draft and this one is final, but they don't have to be put into the Federal Register. And that's a really important distinction that happened around 2016, 2018, to just reduce the load on the staff for making things in perfect legalese. This is really the scientist just saying, what's the status? What's the status of this species? So let's take a look at the 2021 one. Species Status Assessment Report for the whitebark pine. And, oh, here, we should see who. Prepared by the Wyoming Ecological Services Field Office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay. So skip the summary here. I just want to show the table of contents. This is really rigorous. So introduction and analytical framework, whitebark pine ecology, factors affecting whitebark pine. Chapter 4 is analysis of current conditions. And Chapter 5 is analysis of future conditions. And yeah, that's it. The rest are appendices. Okay, heading back. Okay, so we just took a look at this citation here, and now we'll continue. Historians attribute this newfound concern for imperiled plants to ongoing global treaty negotiations, especially in 1972 and 1973, toward what would eventually be adopted in 1975 under the title Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES. Prior to this time, attention to the conservation needs of native plants had been stalled by complications that do not pertain to animals. How to adequately distinguish plants illegally collected in the wild from plants propagated from seeds or cuttings taken from horticultural specimens was among the points of contention. Ultimately, federal authority over enforcement of endangered plant protections has centered on regulation of interstate commerce of such plants. This legal distinction for plants became controversial in practice when a group of citizens, Torreya guardians, chose to help an endangered glacial relic plant, Florida torreya. And of course, over to the right here, you can see this is the map of where the Peak Glacial Refuge, the historically native range is, right here, just a bit in northern Florida. And then where Torreya guardians have experimented planting it. And we started to get seeds produced in Cleveland in 2018, and then more here in 2024 in North Carolina. Terrea guardians. Okay. When a group of citizens, Terrea guardians, chose to help an endangered glacial relic plant, Florida terrea, move to cooler poleward climates before conservation professionals were ready to begin their own experimentation with assisted migration of endangered species. Because movement of seeds and seedlings by this group was non-commercial and based on horticulturally produced specimens, there was no legal apparatus to halt their actions. And so that's why we've been doing it for 2 decades. Another distinction is that when an animal is listed as endangered, taking of that animal by capture or killing becomes a violation of the Act. For plants, taking occurs only within the boundaries of federal properties. Even so, states may choose to legislate and enforce prohibitions even on private lands, as occurred in 2023, when the state of California passed a law that prevented killing or removal of the western variety of Joshua tree wherever it was found. Climate change risk was a key factor in the determination. Moving on to 2 categories for listing species. The Act distinguished 2 grades of species for listing, endangered and a lesser category called threatened. An endangered species is in danger of extinction now. A threatened species faces such a threat in the foreseeable future. The aim for the lesser threatened category is to enable some protective actions by federal agencies at an earlier time, and to encourage state governments to take the lead on conserving such species, such that the causes of population decline might be corrected before more serious concerns develop. Controversy also arises as to whether and what differences in recovery plan elements, and thus management policies and restrictions, should distinguish threatened from endangered. Accordingly, when the West Indian manatee, whose northward habitat extends into southern Florida, was downlisted in 2017, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stated that, quote, the downlisting will not diminish any existing federal protections. The agency maintains a webpage that lists all the endangered and threatened animal species. As of February 2025, the total was 742 animals. The set is organized into 10 groups and appears on the webpage in this order: amphibians, arachnids, that's scary things like spiders and scorpions and ticks, birds, clams, crustaceans, fishes, insects, mammals, reptiles, and snails. 5 criteria for making listing decisions. The Act specifies the types of causes to be identified in species decline, any one of which might be severe enough to merit listing the species as threatened or endangered. Also known as the 5 factors, the set of possible causes entail, and here are the 5, the present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of its habitat or range, overutilization for commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes, disease or predation, the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms, other natural or man-made factors affecting its survival. The agency maintains a web page for the public to access the complete list of endangered animals and a separate web page for endangered plants. So we've already looked at the endangered plant one, so let's take a look at the list of endangered animals. So here it is in the references. Clicking on it, we come to here, and you see 748 species listing as of the present time here in April 2026. And you can sort by group or put it in, but you can see there it goes down through there. All right, so we just looked at this reference, list of endangered animals, and now we'll continue on. The agency also maintains a web page that lists in tabular format all the species of plants and animals that have been reclassified and when that occurred. Total entries on that list were 65 as of February 2025. Some entries are just populations rather than full species or subspecies. For example, at the beginning of the list are two populations of California tiger salamander. One is in Sonoma County and the other in Santa Barbara County. Both were reclassified from endangered to threatened in 2004. And I just mentioned here on the Wikipedia page, this shows up alongside. But here you can see two populations of California tiger salamander were downlisted. And there's the reference. Okay. There is also an online web page that documents in tabular format all species that have been delisted. One of the columns is used to distinguish whether the species is foreign or domestic. Some migratory birds and mammals, notably whales, are categorized as both domestic and foreign. The delisting date and reason for delisting are also supplied, with the latter coming in several types. So here are the four possible reasons for delisting. Species has recovered. The species is extinct. New information indicates the species does not meet the definition of an endangered species. And that one usually happens when outlying populations are discovered that just weren't known about when the species was first petitioned for listing. And if there's enough individuals in those populations, it might have already met the qualification for delisting that shows up in the recovery plan. And finally, new information indicates the species does not meet the definition of a species. And that's where the taxonomists who classify genera and species come up with different views and have them published in a peer-reviewed journal. Okay, recovery plans must be made and published. A key provision of the 1973 Act was that preventing extinction would no longer be sufficient. Rather, recovery of listed species, such that delisting could ensue, became a stated goal. So recovery becomes very important. Moving down here, amendments to the law in 1988 required recovery plans to be published in a two-step process, draft and final, for facilitating public comments. The initial statute had in it that the listing petition itself, the listing process, would be a two-step process for public comments, but the recovery plans weren't until 1988 amendments. The 1988 amendments required by law these three elements: the management actions, objective, measurable criteria for downlisting and delisting, and estimated time and cost for achieving recovery. And as I mentioned in part one, given my experience with Torreya taxifolia as an endangered listed species since 1986, 40 years hasn't been enough to even get it downlisted to threatened by the official program. And they don't consider the actions of Torreya guardians outside of historical native range, and by us, as contributing anything. Critical habitat may be designated. The 1973 Act introduced the concept of what is now called critical habitat in only one brief passage. Section 7 required federal agencies to ensure that actions they authorized, funded, or carried out would not result in, quote, the destruction or modification of habitat of such species, which is determined by the Secretary after consultation as appropriate with affected states to be critical, end quote. So that was just one word, critical. That was in the original act. When the act was amended in 1978, critical habitat was given a definition and basic terms for how it would be determined and used. The 1978 amendments also provided for the consideration of economic impacts when designating critical habitat and provided a mechanism for excluding critical habitat where the benefits of exclusion would outweigh the benefits of designating the area as critical habitat. A key distinction in how it is to be determined was summarized in a Congressional Research Service report in 2016. And this is a quote. Although economic factors are not to be considered in the listing of a species as endangered or threatened, economic factors must be considered in the designation of critical habitat. Some habitat areas may be excluded from designation based on such concerns, unless the failure to designate habitat would result in the extinction of the species. As will be seen in the controversies section, this provision is sometimes challenging to implement for both scientific and political reasons, as when more than 1 million acres of critical habitat was proposed in 2024 for the rusty-patched bumblebee. As of February 2025, 964 critical habitat documents are listed and linked online by the agency. Okay, rusty-patched bumblebee. I have a picture I added to the Wikipedia page up here. Moving on to the next subsection, interagency cooperation. The Act, as amended, directs all federal agencies to use their authorities to help conserve listed species. Such actions include the granting of licenses, contracts, leases, easements, rights-of-way, permits, or grants in aid, or actions directly or indirectly causing modifications to land, water, or air. In practice, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Forest Service within the Department of Agriculture, and the Bureau of Land Management within the Department of Interior regularly must take action in accordance with this statutory directive. Documents that are published in advance of action decisions include environmental impact statements and formal biological opinions. We're going to move down here and just note that this Section 7 consultation issued biological opinions. That's a formal term, or what apply here. And very importantly, the best available science. This is what gets litigated quite often. Okay, so I want to take a look at a reference here. This is what it looks like. This is not the regular way things look, but you can see this is the Section 7 consultation issued biological opinions. And let's see how many there are. Okay, 4,726 entries as of April 2026. And so here's the different lead agencies. Yeah, look at this. The Environmental Protection Agency, probably, clean water. Army Corps of Engineers, maybe a river would be affected for damming or flooding. Forest Service. And then here are the specific species. That one is very technical. Okay, we just finished looking at this, and now critical habitat reports are also listed by species and agency on the same ECOS Environmental Conservation online system. As of February 2025, the Biological Opinions webpage lists 4,259 entries. Okay, so it's still, in 2026, still in the 4,000 some range. Moving on to the next subsection, international cooperation. The only thing I really want to show in this first part is that the central feature of the Act is listing, protecting, and recovering domestic species of animals and plants that are threatened or endangered. Additionally, Section 8 of the Act directs that international treaties and conventions pertaining to imperiled species are also to be implemented. And of course, that's at the portal gates where planes and ships and so forth enter, and agents look for illegal possessions. Moving on, I do want to show this. International and domestic plants and animals protected under the Endangered Species Act as of 2020. So this green area here is domestic plant species that are endangered, 772. Domestic animal species endangered, 503. Domestic plants threatened, 372. Domestic animal species threatened, 215. And the purple here is foreign species that are threatened, 594. And a little bit for foreign species that are endangered. Okay, final section here. Citizens can petition for listing species. A review of the Act published in 2009 recounted the unavoidable problems that arose from granting opportunities even for citizens to submit petitions for species listing. And I've done that myself. I submitted a petition to downlist from endangered to threatened Florida torreya, and of course it was rejected. But I was able and didn't have to spend any money doing so. I really appreciate that. So here's a quote from a review of the Act published in 2009. Soon after the Endangered Species Act was enacted, Congress recognized that at any given time, there were likely to be more species potentially eligible for listing than the service could address through the rulemaking process. And remember, this requires the staff to do this. And if the staff keeps fluctuating in, out, more or less as the administrations change, it's just really hard to have some consistency once one of these things gets started. As a result, Congress in 1979 directed the service to develop a prioritization system that would enable it to determine which of the potentially eligible species should be considered first. The service responded with listing priority guidance that established a hierarchy of priorities based first on the magnitude of threat, then upon its imminence, how soon might it happen, and finally upon taxonomic distinctiveness, with monotypic genera ranked ahead of other species and full species ranked ahead of subspecies. The word monotypic genera simply means that when you have a species called Torreya taxifolia, Torreya is the genus and taxifolia is the species. And if it's only one species in the genus in the entire world, boy, you've got high ranking. But Torreya has one other species in the United States. That's Torreya in the California area. And then there's 3 or 4 or 5, depending on how you count them, over in East Asia. Okay. Requirements that listing decisions be made based on scientific evidence and considerations, coupled with an inability of the agencies to expand and contract staffing based on shifts in the volume of outstanding petitions. This induced Congress in 1982 to amend the Act by establishing deadlines for agency decisions. As of 2023, those deadlines still nominally apply, but in practice it is rare for a petitioner to approach the judicial system to force a decision before the agency is able to finish the job on its own timetable. And as you'll see down in the challenges and controversies section, one of the ways that the agency itself has tried to unload itself of these just impossible to do things is it's asked Congress in the Budget Act to put in a rider that limits the amount of money that can be spent on listing decisions so that they have time for doing other things, such as recovery. All right, well, we'll learn about that later. And as it happens, the challenges and controversies section is what we come to next. This is the end of part 2 of the multi-part series on the Endangered Species Act of 1973. The link to part 3 and later episodes can be found in the caption of this YouTube video. You'll also find a time-coded table of topics there, key to all 8 of the subsection titles in the main section called Features of the 1973 Act as Amended. I'm Connie Barlow.